Jake Martinez wiped the grease from his hands as he walked through the empty corridors of Orbital Station, Nexus 7. The night shift was always quiet in the scrapyards where old spaceships came to die. Most of the alien workers had gone to sleep hours ago, leaving only a few humans like Jake to keep the station running through the dark hours. Jake had been working at the station for 3 years now. Every day was the same routine of cutting apart old ships and sorting their parts into different piles. The Federation called it recycling, but Jake knew it was just a fancy word for throwing away perfectly good machines. The aliens who ran the station never bothered to look closely at what they were scrapping. If their computers said a ship was old and worthless, then into the melting furnaces it went. Tonight felt different though. Jake had received orders to start processing a ship that had been sitting in the far corner of the yard for months. The work order called it Scrap Unit 2847, but Jake could see this was no ordinary piece of junk. The ship was massive, easily 3 times bigger than most of the vessels that came through the yard. Its hull was dark gray metal that looked thick enough to stop a missile. Even covered in dust and neglect, Jake could tell this ship had been built for war. Jake grabbed his toolkit and headed toward the forgotten vessel. The airlock was sealed tight, but his maintenance codes still worked. The heavy door slid open with a deep, grinding sound that echoed through the empty space around them. Jake stepped inside and felt immediately that something was different about this ship. The corridors were wide enough for 3 people to walk side by side. The walls were lined with thick metal plates instead of the thin sheets most modern ships used. Everything about this place screamed strength and durability. Jake made his way toward what he hoped was the main computer room. His flashlight beam cut through the darkness as he walked past room after room of silent machinery. Most of the equipment looked strange to him, but he recognized the basic principles. Pipes carried fluids, cables carried power, and control panels managed systems. The design was different from modern ships, but the logic was the same. When Jake finally found the computer core, he was amazed by what he saw. Instead of the small crystal matrices that powered modern ships, this vessel had rows of massive processing units built like tank armor. Each component was 3 times larger than it needed to be, and had backup systems for the backup systems. Jake had never seen engineering this careful and thorough. Jake connected his portable computer to one of the access ports and started downloading whatever data he could find. Most of the files were corrupted or written in languages his translator could not understand. But slowly, pieces of information began to make sense. The ship was called the Iron Covenant. It had been built by a race called the Valorians for something called the Dominion War. That war had ended over 200 years ago, and the Valorians were extinct now. According to the files Jake could read, the Iron Covenant had been one of the most successful warships of its time. It had fought in over 50 major battles and had never been defeated. The ship could operate for years without returning to base, and could repair most damage using its own manufacturing systems. When the war ended, the Iron Covenant and ships like it were decommissioned, not because they were broken, but because the peace treaty required all military vessels to be scrapped. Jake spent the rest of his shift exploring the ship and learning about its systems. The more he saw, the more impressed he became. The power plant was built to run for decades without maintenance. The hull could absorb damage that would destroy modern ships. The weapon systems were simple, but devastatingly effective. Most importantly, everything was designed to be repaired and modified using basic tools and common materials. By the time his shift ended, Jake had made a decision that would change his life forever. He was not going to let this magnificent ship be turned into scrap metal. The Federation might think the Iron Covenant was obsolete, but Jake could see its true value. This was not just an old warship. This was a machine built by people who understood that wars were won, not by having the newest technology, but by having equipment that worked when everything else failed. Jake began making plans as he walked back to his quarters. He would need to work slowly and carefully. Station security monitored all the major systems, but they paid little attention to power usage in the scrapyards. If he was smart about it, Jake could probably restore basic systems without anyone noticing. He had access to thousands of spare parts from other ships being scrapped. Most importantly, he had something the original builders would have appreciated: the determination to make something great out of what others considered worthless. Jake knew he was taking a huge risk. Stealing Federation property could get him sent to prison for years. But as he thought about the Iron Covenant sitting alone in the dark, waiting to be destroyed, Jake realized he had no choice. Some things were too important to let die just because bureaucrats with computers said they had no value. The Iron Covenant deserved better than the scrap heap, and Jake was going to make sure it got the chance to prove its worth once again. 3 months had passed since Jake first discovered the Iron Covenant, and his secret project was finally showing results. Every night after his regular shift ended, Jake would slip away to the forgotten corner of the scrap yard, where his ship waited. He had managed to restore power to 4 decks and get the basic life support systems running. The work was slow and dangerous, but Jake felt more alive than he had in years. Jake had become an expert at salvaging parts from other ships scheduled for scrapping. A power coupling from a Zentari freighter worked perfectly in the Iron Covenant's engine room. Navigation computers from a dozen different species could be modified to work with the ship's ancient but reliable systems. Most of the alien supervisors never bothered to check if every piece of scrap made it to the recycling furnaces, so Jake had plenty of materials to work with. The more Jake learned about the Iron Covenant, the more amazed he became. The ship's designers had built redundancy into every system. If the main power grid failed, there were 3 backup networks. If the primary engines were damaged, smaller engines could push the ship at half speed. Even the hull plating was designed so that damaged sections could be removed and replaced without dry dock facilities. This was a ship built to fight far from home for years at a time. Jake's careful work had not gone completely unnoticed. Lisa Park, who worked in the station's data analysis department, had begun to notice unusual power draws from the scrapyards during night shifts. Lisa was responsible for monitoring energy usage across the station, and she prided herself on knowing where every kilowatt went. When her reports started showing power consumption in areas that should have been completely shut down, she decided to investigate personally. Lisa found Jake one night as he was installing a new power converter in the Iron Covenant's engine room. Instead of reporting him to security as Jake feared she would, Lisa became fascinated by what she saw. As a data analyst, Lisa understood the value of information, and she could tell immediately that Jake had discovered something important. The ship's computer systems alone were worth more than most people made in a lifetime, even if they were considered obsolete by current standards. Jake was hesitant to trust Lisa at first, but he soon realized he needed help. Restoring a warship was too big a job for one person, especially when that person also had to maintain his cover by doing his regular work during the day. Lisa had access to the station's central databases and could help Jake find technical manuals and spare parts. More importantly, she could help him understand what was happening in the galaxy beyond the scrapyards. Lisa's research revealed disturbing information that the regular news feeds were not reporting. Several human colonies on the Outer Rim had gone silent over the past 6 months. Official Federation reports called these incidents minor communication failures or equipment problems, but Lisa found evidence of something much more serious. Refugee ships were arriving at Federation stations with stories of coordinated attacks by unknown raiders. These were not random pirates looking for easy targets. Someone was specifically hunting human settlements. The Federation's response to these attacks had been slow and bureaucratic. Military commanders were treating the incidents as local security problems rather than signs of a larger threat. The few patrol ships sent to investigate had found only empty colonies and debris fields. No survivors, no witnesses, and no clear evidence of who was responsible for the attacks. Jake and Lisa began to understand that the Iron Covenant might be more than just an interesting restoration project. The Federation's modern ships were fast and efficient, but they were designed for peacekeeping and trade protection. They had light armor and weapons suited for chasing pirates or mediating disputes between merchant vessels. Against a serious military threat, these ships would be outgunned and vulnerable. The Iron Covenant was different. This ship had been built specifically for the kind of prolonged combat that the human colonies might soon face. Its thick armor could absorb punishment that would cripple modern vessels. Its massive weapon systems could match firepower with ships twice its size. Most importantly, it was designed to operate independently for extended periods without support from home bases or supply lines. Jake's work on the ship took on new urgency as more reports of attacks reached the station. He began focusing on the most critical systems first. The main engines were already online and tested. The life support systems could keep a crew alive for months. Now Jake needed to get the weapons and defensive systems working. These were the most complex parts of the ship, but also the most important if his growing fears about the future proved correct. Lisa helped by accessing restricted databases and finding technical specifications for weapon systems from the Dominion War era. She also began monitoring Federation military communications, looking for any information about the mysterious raiders that the official news was not reporting. What she found was even more disturbing than Jake had feared. The attacks were not random or opportunistic. They followed a pattern that suggested careful planning and detailed intelligence about human defenses. As Jake worked late into another night, connecting the final power feeds to the Iron Covenant's main weapon batteries, he realized that his hobby project had become something much more serious. The Federation might consider this ship obsolete, but Jake was beginning to suspect that obsolete technology might be exactly what humanity needed to survive what was coming. The Iron Covenant had been designed by people who understood that sometimes the old ways of doing things were the best ways, especially when survival was at stake. 6 months had passed since Jake began his secret restoration of the Iron Covenant, and the ship was finally beginning to look like the warship it had once been. The main engines hummed with steady power, life support systems maintained perfect atmosphere throughout the restored sections, and most importantly, the weapon systems were online and ready for testing. Jake had transformed tons of scrap metal and forgotten technology into something that could fight and win against modern threats. Jake's activities had not remained completely hidden though. Station Security Chief Krex had begun to notice irregularities in the scrapyard operations. Power consumption reports showed energy being used in sections that should have been completely shut down. Inventory records indicated that valuable components were disappearing from ships scheduled for recycling. Most concerning of all, several security cameras in the remote areas of the station had mysteriously malfunctioned over the past few weeks. Krex was a methodical alien who believed that humans were naturally inclined toward theft and mischief. He had been looking for an excuse to crack down on the human workers for months, and these irregularities gave him the justification he needed. Krex began planning a comprehensive security sweep of the entire scrapyard, complete with armed guards and detailed inventory checks. He was determined to catch whoever was stealing Federation property and make an example of them. The situation became critical when a massive refugee convoy arrived at Nexus 7, carrying survivors from 3 human colonies that had been completely destroyed. The convoy consisted of damaged freighters, converted passenger ships, and anything else that could carry people away from the devastation. Many of the ships were barely holding together, their hulls scarred by weapon fire, and their engines running on emergency power. Among the refugees was Captain Ben Hayes, a former human naval officer whose patrol ship had been destroyed while trying to defend Henderson Colony. Ben brought devastating news that confirmed Jake and Lisa's worst fears. The raiders were not pirates or random attackers. They were advanced scouts for a massive invasion force that had been systematically studying Federation defenses and identifying weak points. Ben explained that the attacks followed a clear pattern. The raiders would arrive in overwhelming numbers, destroy all defensive installations, eliminate any ships that tried to escape, and then systematically hunt down every human on the planet. They were not interested in capturing territory or stealing resources. Their goal appeared to be the complete elimination of human presence in the outer RIM territories. The Federation's response had been completely inadequate. Military commanders refused to believe that a serious threat existed, dismissing the attacks as isolated incidents. The few patrol ships sent to investigate were too small and too lightly armed to pose any real challenge to the raiders. Even worse, Federation bureaucracy was slowing down any meaningful response. By the time authorization came through for military action, the raiders had already moved on to their next target. When Ben learned about Jake's restoration project, he immediately recognized the Iron Covenant's potential. As a trained military officer, Ben understood that modern Federation ships were designed for peacekeeping operations, not serious warfare. They relied on speed and technology rather than armor and firepower. Against an enemy that was specifically hunting humans, these ships would be sitting ducks. The Iron Covenant was different. Ben could see that this ship had been designed by people who understood real combat. Every system was built to keep fighting even when damaged. The weapons were simple but devastatingly effective. Most importantly, the ship could operate independently, 4 months without requiring supply lines or maintenance support from friendly bases. Ben agreed to help Jake complete the restoration, bringing military expertise that Jake desperately needed. While Jake understood the mechanical aspects of the ship, Ben knew how to use its systems for actual combat. He began training Jake and Lisa on basic military procedures while helping to optimize the ship's weapons and defensive systems for the kind of fighting they would likely face. Working around the clock, the team managed to bring the Iron Covenant to full operational status just as Krex closed in on their operation. The security chief had finally traced the power irregularities to their source and was preparing to arrest the thieves who had been stealing Federation property. Krex arrived at the scrapyard with a full security team, expecting to find a few humans with stolen components hidden in some storage compartment. Instead, Krex found the Iron Covenant powered up and ready for departure. The massive warship's engines were online, its weapons were charged, and its navigation systems were plotting a course away from the station. Jake had literally stolen an entire warship from under the nose of Federation security. But he had done it to save human lives that the Federation seemed willing to sacrifice to bureaucratic incompetence. When Krex demanded that Jake surrender the ship and submit to arrest, Ben stepped forward and explained the reality of the situation. Human colonies were being systematically destroyed while Federation forces debated jurisdiction and filed paperwork. The Iron Covenant represented the only real hope for defending the remaining human settlements until proper military support could be organized. Jake made the final decision as station security surrounded the Iron Covenant. He activated the ship's engines and began moving toward the exit of the scrapyard. He had not stolen this ship for personal gain or criminal purposes. He had restored it because someone needed to take action while the Federation wasted time with politics and procedure. The Iron Covenant had been built to protect people, and Jake was going to make sure it fulfilled that purpose once again, regardless of what Federation law said about his right to do so. As the Iron Covenant left Nexus 7 behind, Jake realized that there was no going back now. He had committed himself to a course of action that would either save human lives or get him killed as a criminal and terrorist. But as he looked at the refugee ships limping toward safety and thought about the colonies that had already been lost, Jake knew he had made the right choice. Some things were more important than following Orders, and protecting innocent people was definitely one of them. Jake, Lisa, and Ben had been running from Federation authorities for 2 weeks when they received the distress signal that would change everything. The Iron Covenant was hiding in an asteroid field near the outer rim, its systems powered down to avoid detection by Federation patrol ships. Jake was still making final adjustments to the ship's weapons when Lisa picked up an emergency transmission from New Denver Colony. The message was fragmentary and filled with static, but the content was clear enough. 3 Raider ships had arrived at New Denver and were systematically destroying the colony's defenses. The settlement's shields were failing, their weapon platforms had been knocked out, and enemy ground forces were preparing to land. Over 50,000 people lived on New Denver, including thousands of children who had nowhere to run. Ben calculated that Federation reinforcements were at least 12 hours away, assuming they had even been dispatched yet. The bureaucrats at Federation Command were still debating whether the attacks constituted a real military threat or just unusually aggressive piracy. By the time they finished their meetings and filed their paperwork, everyone on New Denver would be dead. Jake made the decision without hesitation. The Iron Covenant was not completely ready for combat, and none of them had any real experience fighting a space battle. But they were the only help New Denver was going to get. Jake powered up the ship's engines, while Ben activated the weapons. Systems and Lisa began scanning for enemy ships. Whatever happened next, they were going to give the Raiders a fight they would not expect. The journey to New Denver took 6 hours at maximum speed. During the trip, Ben tried to teach Jake and Lisa the basics of space combat, while Jake made last-minute repairs to systems that were still giving him trouble. The ship's main weapons were working, but several of the secondary systems were unreliable. The shields were functional, but not at full strength. Most concerning of all, the navigation computer kept giving error messages that Jake could not identify. When they arrived at New Denver, the situation was even worse than the distress message had indicated. The 3 Raider ships were massive vessels, each one larger than the Iron Covenant, and bristling with modern weapons. They had positioned themselves around the colony, and were taking turns bombarding different sections of the settlement. The colony's few defensive ships had already been destroyed, and the orbital stations were burning wreckage. Ben took command of the tactical systems, while Jake managed the engines and power distribution. Lisa coordinated their sensors and communications, trying to keep track of all 3 enemy ships, while maintaining contact with the colony's emergency command center. None of them had ever done anything like this before, but they had no choice, except to learn quickly or die trying. The Iron Covenant's first attack caught the Raiders completely by surprise. Jake brought the ship in fast and low, using the planet's gravity well to mask their approach until the last possible moment, when they opened fire. The ancient weapon systems proved their worth. The Iron Covenant's main guns punched through the nearest Raiders' shields, like they were made of paper, and left massive holes in the enemy hull. The Raiders recovered quickly though, and Jake soon learned why modern ships relied on speed and maneuverability instead of armor and firepower. The enemy vessels were faster than the Iron Covenant and could change direction much more quickly. They began circling around Jake's ship, hitting it with coordinated attacks from multiple angles, while staying out of range of the heavy weapons that were the Iron Covenant's main advantage. Jake's inexperience nearly cost them everything during the first few minutes of combat. He tried to chase one of the Raiders and left the Iron Covenant exposed to attack from the other 2. Enemy weapons tore into the ship's hull, causing massive damage to several decks and knocking out 2 of the secondary weapon systems. Warning alarms filled the bridge as Jake struggled to keep the ship's vital systems online. Ben realized that they needed to change tactics if they were going to survive. Instead of trying to outmaneuver the faster enemy ships, he told Jake to position the Iron Covenant between the Raiders and the colony. The ship's heavy armor could absorb punishment that would destroy the settlement's remaining defenses. and their weapons could cover the evacuation of civilians to underground shelters. The battle turned into a brutal test of endurance. The raiders pounded the Iron Covenant with everything they had, but the ship's thick hull, plating, and redundant systems kept it fighting when any modern vessel would have been destroyed. Jake rerouted power from damaged systems to keep the weapons firing, while Lisa coordinated with the colony's defenders to target the most critical enemy systems. Slowly, the Iron Covenant's superior firepower began to tell. One of the raider ships suffered a critical hit to its main reactor and exploded in a brilliant flash of light. A second raider took heavy damage to its engines and began drifting out of control. The third ship, realizing that this was not the easy victory they had expected, began to retreat toward the edge of the system. Jake wanted to pursue the fleeing raider, but Ben convinced him to let it go. The Iron Covenant had taken serious damage during the fight, and they needed time to make repairs before taking on another enemy ship. More importantly, they had accomplished their primary objective. New Denver Colony was safe, and over 50,000 people were alive because 3 humans and a stolen warship had been willing to fight when no one else would. Word of their victory spread quickly through the human communication networks. For the first time since the attacks began, a human settlement had successfully defended itself against the raiders. The Iron Covenant became a symbol of hope for the isolated colonies that had been living in fear of the next attack. Jake found himself receiving messages from settlements across the Outer Rim, asking for help and offering whatever support they could provide. Jake realized that their fight was just beginning. One victory did not mean the war was won, and the raiders would be back with more ships and better tactics. But, as he looked at the damage reports from New Denver and thought about the lives they had saved, Jake knew they had made the right choice. The Iron Covenant had proven that human determination and old-fashioned engineering could stand against any enemy, no matter how advanced their technology might be. 6 months after the battle at New Denver Colony, the Iron Covenant had become something far greater than Jake could have ever imagined. What started as one man's restoration project had grown into the flagship of an improvised human defense fleet. The ship that Jake had pulled from a scrapyard now commanded a force of 30 vessels, all crewed by volunteers who had refused to wait for the Federation to protect them. Jake's single stolen warship had inspired the formation of independent defense militias throughout human space. Settlements that had been marked for evacuation were now building their own weapon platforms and training civilian crews to fight. The Iron Covenant served as a mobile base for these efforts, providing technical support and military expertise to communities that had never needed to defend themselves before. The ship itself had been transformed by months of continuous upgrades and modifications. Jake had incorporated salvaged alien technology with human engineering principles, creating hybrid systems that were more effective than either approach alone. Lisa had installed advanced sensor networks that could track enemy movements across multiple star systems. Ben had added weapon systems from a dozen different species, giving the Iron Covenant firepower that could match ships 3 times its size. Lisa had evolved from a data analyst into the fleet's intelligence coordinator, using her access to Federation databases to predict raider movements and coordinate defensive strategies. She had built a network of informants and sympathizers throughout Federation space, providing early warning when enemy forces were massing for attacks. Most importantly, she had proven that information could be just as powerful as weapons when used correctly. Ben had proven himself as a capable fleet commander, turning desperate civilians into effective soldiers and scattered resistance cells into a coordinated military force. He had established training programs that taught merchant crews how to fight in defense academies that turned farmers and miners into naval officers. Under his leadership, the human defense fleet had won a dozen major engagements without losing a single ship. Jake had become something of a legend among human engineers, his modifications to the Iron Covenant serving as blueprints for upgrading other salvaged vessels. His techniques for combining different technologies had been copied throughout human space, creating a new generation of warships that were uniquely human in their approach to combat. More importantly, he had proven that creativity and determination could overcome any technological disadvantage. The Raider threat had escalated along with human resistance efforts. What had started as isolated attacks on Outer Rim colonies had become a full-scale invasion aimed at the heart of human civilization. Intelligence reports indicated that a massive enemy fleet was massing near the edge of Federation space, preparing for an assault on Earth itself. The Raiders had finally decided that humanity posed too great a threat to be allowed to survive. Federation forces, finally recognizing the true scale of the threat, had mobilized their entire military to defend humanity's homeworld. Hundreds of ships from dozens of species had assembled near Earth, creating the largest defensive fleet in Federation history. But Jake knew from experience that quantity was not the same as quality, and most Federation ships were simply not designed for the kind of warfare they were about to face. The climactic battle began when the Raider invasion fleet dropped out of hyperspace at the edge of the solar system. The enemy force was larger than anyone had expected, consisting of over 200 warships supported by countless smaller vessels. These were not the fast raiders that had been attacking isolated colonies. These were massive battleships designed to destroy entire worlds and eliminate any possibility of resistance. Federation forces moved to intercept the invasion fleet, but they quickly found themselves outgunned and outmaneuvered. The enemy ships were faster, better armed, and more heavily armored than intelligence reports had indicated. Within hours of the battle's beginning, Federation lines began to collapse as ship after ship was destroyed or forced to retreat. The Iron Covenant and its associated defense fleet arrived just as the situation became critical. Jake had brought every ship he could muster, from converted freighters to captured raider vessels that had been modified with human technology. The fleet was outnumbered 10-1, but Jake knew that numbers alone would not determine the outcome of this battle. Ben coordinated the fleet's attack with precision that would have impressed any military academy. Instead of trying to match the enemy ship for ship, he used the Iron Covenant's unique capabilities to disrupt enemy formations and create opportunities for the smaller human vessels. The ship's heavy armor allowed it to absorb punishment, while the rest of the fleet maneuvered into position. Jake's mechanical genius showed itself in the heat of battle as he rerouted power and modified systems in real time to meet changing tactical requirements. When the main weapons overheated, he found ways to increase their cooling efficiency. When the shields failed, he redistributed armor plating to protect critical systems. Most importantly, he kept the Iron Covenant fighting when any other ship would have been destroyed. Lisa's information warfare capabilities proved decisive in turning the tide of battle. She had spent months studying Raider communication protocols and tactical procedures, learning how their command structure operated. When the critical moment came, she was able to jam enemy communications and feed false information to their fleet commanders, causing confusion and coordination failures that the human forces exploited ruthlessly. The final assault came when Jake realized that the enemy flagship was the key to their entire operation. The massive vessel was coordinating attacks across the entire battle space, and its destruction would leave the Raider fleet blind and confused. Jake made the decision to ram the Iron Covenant directly into the enemy command ship, sacrificing his beloved vessel to save Earth and everyone on it. But Ben had a better idea. Instead of destroying the Iron Covenant, they would use its unique combination of armor and firepower to punch through the enemy's defenses and deliver a precision strike that would disable the flagship without destroying their own ship. It was a desperate plan that required perfect timing and incredible skill, but it was their best chance of victory. The attack succeeded beyond their wildest expectations. The Iron Covenant's guns tore through the enemy flagships, shields, and armor, leaving it drifting helplessly in space. Without their command ship, the Raider fleet began to fall apart as individual captains fled or surrendered rather than continuing a hopeless fight. The invasion that was supposed to destroy humanity had been turned into a complete victory for the defenders. The battle's end brought unexpected recognition for Jake and his companions. Federation officials who had once considered them criminals and terrorists now offered them positions of honor and responsibility. Jake was asked to become chief engineer for a new military shipbuilding program that would incorporate human engineering principles into next-generation warships. The Iron Covenant was officially commissioned as the flagship of humanity's new naval force. Jake accepted the position, but he insisted that the Iron Covenant remain exactly what it had always been, a symbol of human determination and ingenuity. The ship would continue to serve as a reminder that sometimes the most obsolete technology, when combined with human creativity and courage, could become the most effective tool for survival. The Federation had learned that humans were not just useful for manual labor and basic engineering. They were warriors and innovators who could protect themselves and others when the need arose.